As you all know, this is our colloquium series, and this is unfortunately the last one for this year. We do have, just to promote it again, I know you've received lots of emails from me, we do have our principals colloquium for our undergrad students. We've invited 5 principals from local counties, from Clark and from Jefferson City and from Oconee County, to come and talk to our undergrad students. They'll be here this Thursday at 5 o'clock. I need to confirm with Leo Teal which room we'll be in, but please tell your undergrad students, both math ed and science ed, to come and ask those principals. We'll have a panel. We'll have some questions that we have for them already, and then it'll be open up to the floor for the students to ask any questions they may have in terms of searching for a job, what is expected of them, etc., from these administrators in the field. Okay. Today we have Dr. Jon Star from Harvard Graduate School of Education. He is an associate professor in human development and education. He received his PhD in 2001 from the University of Michigan, along with a MA in cognitive psychology. He also went to Harvard University for his MED, and before that got his bachelor's in electrical engineering from Brown University. He taught for 6 years at both the middle school and high school level. Since beginning his career in academia, he has become the executive editor for Cognition and Instruction, as well as the co-editor for the Elementary School Journal, and is still on the editorial board for Contemporary Educational Psychology in the International Journal of STEM Education. He has written many publications, including in Mathematical Thinking and Learning, JRME, JMTE, Journal of Mathematical Behavior, and Contemporary Educational Psychology. We are very welcome to have Dr. Jon Star to present for us this research.
Thanks, Carlos. Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to come here and speak to you today. It's really nice to reconnect with some old friends here and also have a chance to interact with some of you that I don't already know. So before jumping in, I just wanted to say that feel free to ask questions whenever you'd like. I do have a slight preference for saving questions toward the end, but if you have a question that you really need answering immediately, then feel free to ask it. That's totally fine. So as you heard in the introduction, I'm a former middle school and high school math teacher, and the research that I do that I'll be talking about today is it lives at the intersection of the fields of math education and educational psychology. As you'll hear, I do work both in the lab and in the classroom, and I use both qualitative and quantitative methods, all in the service of answering the following 2 research themes. The first theme is that I seek to develop clarity about instructional outcomes for the learning of mathematics. I want to know what our learning goals should be for our students, including sub-questions such as what knowledge and skills should students develop while they're learning math? What words or phrases do we use to refer to these outcomes? How can we measure these outcomes? Among the many answers to these types of questions, a particular mathematical learning goal that I'm interested in is what I refer to as flexibility, which I'll be defining more in just a second. The second theme of my research has to do with instructional strategies that reliably lead to these instructional outcomes. So with respect to the case of flexibility, I'd like to know what should math teachers do to foster the development of flexibility? How should instructional routines and materials be structured so as to promote flexibility? And among the many answers to these questions that I pursue, the one I'm most interested in right now as an instructional strategy is the comparison of multiple strategies as a means toward flexibility. And again, I'll be talking a lot more about this. The structure of my talk is as follows. I'm going to walk you through 3 studies that sort of are a retrospective walkthrough of my work around flexibility as a learning outcome and comparison of multiple strategies as an instructional approach. I'll reflect more generally on this program of research, particularly on the movement I've done between the lab and the classroom and back, and also my attempts to live at this intersection point between the fields of math education and educational psychology. So before we start, understanding my research requires that we do some careful thinking about mathematics, which I know at a place like this is not unusual or out of the ordinary. We need to think a little more about what we teach students and what we want them to learn. And so I'm going to pick a certain domain that's of interest to me and have us think about some math with respect to that domain. So I'd like you to consider this equation. This is a linear equation that students see in pre-algebra or algebra, and I'd like you to think for a moment about how you would solve this equation. There's no need to write anything down or even to contribute. I'm going to ask you just to think about it for a moment. So there's a lot I could say about this problem. I'll start by saying that one standard approach that's taught for how to solve this problem, it's taught as the way to do it in many texts, looks as follows. We might distribute first and then subtract 3 from both sides, divide by 4. So that's one standard approach. The question that I'd like to ask about this problem and this approach, and there's many ways to solve this problem, which I'll get back to in a moment. But the question I'd like you to think about for a moment is what mathematical knowledge is drawn upon when we solve this problem? That's the question that's of interest to me. What do we know that enables us to solve this problem? Well, in the field of mathematics education, I would argue that in recent history, or at least for the past 30 years, the way the field has answered the question I just posed to you would be to say that there are 2 categories of mathematical knowledge that we can talk about as enabling us to solve problems. One might be called conceptual knowledge, which is typically defined as understanding of key concepts in the field. And in this particular case, with equation solving, these key concepts might include equivalence or variable or properties of equality, for example. This phrase, conceptual knowledge, is typically used synonymously with another phrase, conceptual understanding. A second category of knowledge that we bring to bear on solving problems would be called procedural knowledge, and that's typically defined as knowing how to execute the steps of a procedure or an algorithm correctly. This framework is almost universally used in mathematics education by researchers, teachers, and policymakers, and so I wanted to reflect for just a moment on why this might be the case. Well, one reason I would argue that this framework is almost universally used is that there does appear to be a difference between ideas and principles on the one hand and processes and algorithms on the other hand. Certainly, these are related and both important, but from my perspective, ontologically and intuitively, they just seem to be a little different, and that might be one reason why this framework feels right and why the field has stuck with it. A second reason that I think this framework is universally used in the field is that there's some perception that the conceptual procedural knowledge distinction is based upon other psychological distinctions about knowledge that might have certain empirical support, such as declarative and procedural knowledge. So there's a sense that conceptual procedural is related to, the same as, drawing from declarative procedural. I've written about my concerns for this framework, and just to say what they are in brief, this is a table from a 2005 article that I published, where I tried to make the case that the common usage of conceptual procedural knowledge confuses knowledge type and knowledge quality. So when we speak about the type of knowledge, that would mean concepts or procedures as 2 types. And when we speak about the quality of knowledge, we might talk about superficial versus deep. Conceptual knowledge has come to mean deep knowledge of concepts, while procedural knowledge has come to mean superficial knowledge of procedures, I argued. And thus, this framework makes it really hard to talk about the 2 cells that you see in question marks there. The question mark for superficial conceptual knowledge is perhaps not especially interesting from a practical or educational point of view, in that it refers to memorized facts or concepts. So these would be technically known as superficially known concepts in this framework, but I don't think that's not a goal, that's not especially interesting. Although I will point out that from my perspective, in the field, memorized facts or concepts would not be called conceptual knowledge by many in the field. Paradoxically, they would be called procedural knowledge. But that aside, I'm more interested in this question mark, the question mark under deep procedural knowledge. I think there are ways that learners can and should know procedures that are deep. I've come to use the word flexibility to refer to one such outcome, and by flexibility, I mean that one should know multiple approaches for solving a given problem, and the ability to select the most appropriate strategy for a given problem or a given problem-solving situation. So you heard a lot more about this framework, but just to take this back to the problem that you solved. Here's the solution method that I showed you was a very standard approach, and as all of you no doubt knew, there are many ways that this could be solved in addition to this method. Among the other symbolic ways to solve this problem, here is one way to think about it. If you notice that on the problem on the left, the solution on the left, the step that I've highlighted is where I divide to both sides. And in the standard algorithm within this problem type, you always do that at the last step. That's where this always happens, the last step. But as you know, it doesn't have to be at the last step. It could be at the first step. And in this problem, if you do it on the first step, I would argue that you've produced a better strategy, a better solution method. I would say it's better because we could argue that it's more efficient. You might use words like elegant to say that it's the best. I would argue that that's a better solution method. But I would also note that if I change the problem slightly, if I change the 15 to a 14, both methods still work just fine. But I would argue that from the perspective of a middle school student, the first method is better. The first method for a middle school student makes less use of fractions, which for a middle school student typically are time-consuming and error-prone, and thus they might argue that the first method is better. Now, my point is, it is not critical to my point that you agree with me that those are the best methods in each of those cases. Rather, the point is that I think we could agree that a flexible solver should know more than one approach and be able to select and justify that most appropriate strategy for a given problem or a given problem-solving goal. This is flexibility, and in this problem it means knowing that this divide to both sides operator can be done and used in many different ways, sometimes with interesting implications in the problem. So let me show you another example that perhaps makes this point differently. So here's a slightly more complicated linear equation, and on the left I'll show you the common strategy for doing this, and since this is the math audience, I can step through these steps fairly fast because I think you know how to solve this equation. In the standard approach, it involves distributing first and going from there. But that's not the only way to solve this equation. If we know something about variables and we understand how variables work, we might notice that those green squares indicating the 5y and the 3y, we can subtract 3y from both sides to get the 2y. We can treat the y plus 1s as variables here and do the exact same thing with them and get 2y plus 1 right there. If I understand what variables are, then I can make that change, and that might be a better way to approach this. And furthermore, you see this divide step that happens at the last of the standard algorithm. I can use the divide step next in this alternative approach, and arguably I end up with a much better solution method. I would argue this is better, it's more efficient. You could say it's more elegant, it's better. So what these examples are trying to illustrate is that there is great value within the discipline of mathematics in selecting the most clever or elegant or efficient or best strategy for solving problems, whether we're talking about equations to solve or proofs. Flexibility, which is knowing more than one way to solve a problem and selecting the most appropriate strategy for that given problem or for a given set of circumstances, is a learning outcome of great importance, and it's what my research program is all about. So I became convinced that this was an important outcome and something that wasn't receiving enough attention in our field, and so I designed a series of studies to try to begin to explore it. These studies began with some initial questions that I had about flexibility. Once I identified that this construct was something I cared about, I first needed to determine how I could measure it. What does it look like? How could I find it and observe it? What does it look like? Furthermore, under what conditions is it or should it be evident in students' problem solving? In particular, when do we expect students to use a variety of strategies, and when do we expect students to consistently use just one strategy? I would argue that's not an obvious question to answer, but an important one if we're interested in flexibility. And furthermore, I began with an initial question about what interventions seem promising for promoting flexibility. With respect to this first issue of measurement, the initial work that I did looked only at students' strategies for problem solving on a post-test as a way to explore flexibility. So essentially I would give them a set of problems to solve, and I would look at what strategies they used and determine if I thought they were flexible or not. But what I quickly discovered is that students may have known alternative approaches, but just not chosen to use them on the particular test that I gave them. And this relates to a commonly written about distinction in psychology that some people call the competence performance distinction, which just notes that what students demonstrate in some situation like a test may not fully reflect all that they know. So that's sort of, in some ways, sort of obvious, but it's something that psychologists have frequently commented on, and it's clearly what's going on here when I give a test for flexibility. So I needed to develop different kind of measures that assess both students' knowledge of multiple strategies as well as their use of multiple strategies, and those needed to be separate. Because just because they don't use a strategy doesn't mean they don't know it or know how it works. So in terms of measures, this was the first bridge we had to cross, and I'll explain how we accomplished this in a moment. In terms of interventions, one initial approach to thinking about flexibility and about having students know multiple strategies is, if I want them to know a strategy and they don't know it, well, I could just show it to them. So that might be one guess as to how flexibility develops. If students need to know what a strategy looks like, you can just show them. A second promising intervention that I wanted to explore was inspired by a Dutch study that I found where the researchers in the Netherlands had done an interesting task where they gave students a problem to solve and then they asked them to solve it again, but in a different way. And they used this as an assessment task, and I decided to explore it as an intervention task. So what this looked like, for example, is I might give them a problem to solve, like the one I gave you. They would solve it, and then I would say, can you do it again? Resolve the same problem, but do it in a different way. And so that was a question in my mind, whether that could lead to this idea of flexibility in them. Would it lead them to learn and know and use multiple strategies? So the first study that I'll describe for you, which I'll call here Study 1, was answering these questions related to these two interventions. The first was, does flexibility improve when students are asked to resolve previously completed problems but using a different strategy? And the second was, well, does a brief strategy demonstration improve flexibility? In this initial study, I worked with 132 sixth graders before they had learned much about how to solve equations. I worked with them for 5 one-hour sessions over 5 days in sort of a summer math enrichment class that I taught. This was a pre-post experimental study, and it was a 2-by-2 study. You heard about the 2 conditions that I was testing to see which one of those worked or whether they interacted with each other. I alluded a moment ago to this challenge about measuring flexibility, so let me speak to my measures. This is a good point to mention that in all of the studies that I do, that you'll hear about today, and generally, I assess conceptual and procedural knowledge as 2 categories of knowledge that the field does value, and which in psychology studies they also tap. I won't be talking to you much about my results about conceptual and procedural knowledge because the talk is really about the flexibility results, but I just wanted you to know that I do assess those, and I'm happy to respond to what I found about conceptual and procedural knowledge. But in terms of flexibility, I mentioned that there was this use set of variables and a knowledge set of variables that I figured out that I needed to do. In the use set of variables, this was where I just gave them a test. I said, solve this equation, and then I looked to see, based on their solution methods, whether they had evidence of knowing multiple approaches, whether they had evidence of knowing efficient approaches. So that's my use measure. But I also had this knowledge measure, which was designed to be, you could think of it as an independent measure. It had other types of questions that were trying to explore what they knew about strategies, even if they didn't use them in the post-test. So I had knowledge of multiple strategies items, and I had knowledge of efficient strategy items, which I will talk about on the next slide. With respect to this knowledge measure then, I had items that were assessing knowledge of multiple strategies. Here's some kind of examples of what those might have looked like. So maybe I gave them an equation that was solved or partially solved, and I might say, hey, can you solve this equation in 2 different ways? Can you identify which steps are possible to do in this equation as a next step? Can you identify the operation that was used to get from this step to the next step? Those are the types of questions that I felt like gave me some information about what they knew about equation solving strategies. I also was interested in knowledge of strategy efficiency. So here's an example of that kind of question. If I give you a partially solved equation, can you indicate whether the solution that's partially accomplished here, is that a good way to solve an equation, and why? So with questions like those, I felt I was able to tap what they knew about equation solving, efficiency, as well as multiple strategies. So the results of this study, let me first speak to the condition where students were asked to resolve previously completed problems. What I found is that prompts to resolve problems in different ways led to greater gains in knowledge and use of multiple strategies. In essence, this intervention worked in getting them to know and use more than one strategy. So here's some data that shows that. This graph on the blue side shows the knowledge results, and this is a marginally significant finding in favor of those that were asked to resolve previously completed problems. On the right in green is the use measure, and this is also a significant finding showing that those who were asked to resolve previously completed problems were able to solve problems in multiple ways more than those who did not. With respect to the strategy demonstration condition, this is where they received a brief demonstration of how to solve an equation. This strategy demonstration led to greater gains in knowledge of efficient strategies. So here's the knowledge measure in blue, and here is the use measure in green. And in both cases, this shows that when students were shown a way to solve an equation that was a reasonably efficient way, this impacted what they knew and what they used about efficient ways. So this was a very early study in trying to explore something about flexibility, and I wouldn't say the results were rocket science or blowing us away here, but it led to us being able to make some claims about measuring flexibility and also some interventions that might help us develop flexibility. It led to a second wave of studies that made a slight change to the first intervention that you heard about. I mentioned that previously I asked students to resolve completed problems. What I decided to do in the second wave of study is use comparison of worked examples as the intervention. So instead of having students generate a second different way, I showed them two different ways and asked them to compare and contrast them. And I thought this might have some role in leading to greater flexibility. And this was paired with self-explanation, as you'll see in the materials in a minute. So I'm going to describe one study that I did as part of a series of studies exploring these questions. Does comparison help students' flexibility? And furthermore, we wanted to know, if it did, what should you compare, when you should compare it, and how you should compare for the learning to be most productive. These were all short-term classroom lab studies, if you will, where we redesigned 2 to 3 math lessons on a particular topic, and they were implemented in students' regular mathematics classes by us as researchers. Why focus on comparison as a promising direction for learning here? Well, there's a rich literature in psychology that comparison helps learners. This is sort of a laundry list of studies and topics where it's been found that if you have students compare and contrast, they learn more than those who don't compare and contrast. Within our field of math education, there's a lot of work that suggests comparison is a good thing too. There's some work that suggests that expert teachers do comparison more than teachers who are less expert. There's some evidence in international cross-cultural studies that teachers in higher performing countries help their students do it. And furthermore, if we look at reform curricula and standards, they advocate for teachers to be doing more comparison. So comparison seemed like a promising avenue to explore whether it might affect flexibility. And it hadn't been examined in that light before, whether comparison might influence flexibility. The second study then was using random assignment within the same classroom to 2 conditions. One condition that I call the compare condition was where students were comparing and contrasting alternative solution methods, and again, we're in the domain of equation solving. And that's contrasted with the sequential condition where students studied the same solution methods sequentially. I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. This was a pre-test, post-test type of study that I worked with 7th grade students. And in this particular study, students studied and explained worked examples with a partner. So this was a pair intervention. So what did the conditions look like? This is a page from the compare condition materials. This group of students would have seen many pages that looked sort of like this. On the left, you can see a hypothetical student whose name is Mandy, who is solving an equation. That's the equation that you saw a bit ago. And she's doing it with the standard approach. Erica, to her right, also a hypothetical student, is using the more innovative strategy here. And you can see there's 2 questions that follow that ask them to understand what these strategies are and to compare them. So compare students saw a lot of pages like this, whereas sequential students would see the same things, just separated on 2 different pages. So you can see Mandy's solution in the upper left which is actually the same as Mandy's problem and solution on the previous slide, and one question following Mandy's solution. In the lower right, you see Erica, who is solving an isomorphic or structurally similar problem as Erica did in the previous slide. It's on a different page and she only has one problem. So again, notice that in these two conditions, they are seeing the same problems, the same strategies, the same number of problems. Everything's identical. The only difference is that for the compare conditions, they appeared together on the same page, and on the sequential, they appeared on separate pages. That's the only difference. The measures that we use to see whether that had an impact on their flexibility, again, I have this use-knowledge distinction that I spoke about a minute ago. In terms of use, we looked at whether they used more efficient solution methods on the post-test, on the procedural knowledge assessment. And in terms of knowledge, same as you saw before, we had an independent measure looking at knowledge of multiple methods and the ability to evaluate methods. And here's also a good chance to mention that in the analysis of the study, since students are working in pairs, we did a multi-level model which had as its levels a pair, a dyad interaction, as well as an individual interaction, which was the appropriate form of analysis for the way the data sorted themselves out. So what did we find? The comparison in this study led to greater gains in flexibility, knowledge, and use. So we found that comparison did work as hypothesized in positively impacting flexibility. This is a graph showing the knowledge measure. This was the independent measure that asked questions about whether they knew multiple strategies. And you can see that there is a significant finding there in favor of the left green bar, which is the comparison group. And this is a graphic showing the use measure, or one of the use measures from this study, which shows the proportion of post-test problems where students used solution methods that we coded as being efficient. And you can see that the comparison students were significantly more likely to use such efficient methods. It's not a huge high number there of the proportion of trials that they used, 17% versus 10%, but it was still a lot more in the comparison conditions of using efficient methods. This study led us to think that there might be something going on with the comparison, and as a result, we did a number of follow-up studies trying to explore comparison in a little more depth and to confirm these results. So some of the initial studies confirmed this promise of comparison for improving flexibility, and some of the later studies explored the impact of certain design features in using comparison, like what do you compare? In the one that you saw, I was comparing the same problem solved two different ways. There's other things you can compare. Two different problems solved the same way, two different problems solved two different ways. So we explored all those different permutations. We also looked at when to compare and how to compare. So lots of different studies here that were helping us learn more about comparison. And the success of these studies led us to think about moving closer to scale. We've been doing these short one-week studies. We decided we wanted to see if this might work in a classroom as a whole. So the third wave of studies, and study 3 that I'll talk about with you, is about classroom studies. So doing classroom studies of this scale, taking a one-week intervention and moving it to a whole year intervention, involves a ton of work. And I want to speak for a minute about the kinds of things that we had to work on to enable us to pursue this in a whole class setting. I have things to say about curriculum, where we had to adapt existing materials, develop new materials, and pilot and revise these materials. Teacher professional development, we had to develop, and we had to revise, and we had to pilot it. And then the measures, we had to adapt our measures as well and validate them, as well as develop other kinds of measures that you need in big studies like this. So let me tackle each one of these in turn. And as I do so, I wanted to point out, as you'll see from my slides, that as we did this development process to move from the lab study to the classroom study, we weren't just doing this as an adaptation development process. We were doing so to further our research agenda and to learn more about comparison and flexibility. And you'll see evidence of that by the way that we actually published a lot of articles that came out of this development process. It wasn't just make new stuff, it was make new stuff, study how it works, see what the field can learn from it, and publish. So with respect to the curriculum materials, we worked closely with a small group of teachers to design and pilot the materials we developed over a full academic year. So we did this in a number of ways. We taught a 3-week summer course to try to test out what such materials would look like and what pedagogies we might use to explore those. We studied teachers' instruction when they were using our pilot materials. We studied teachers' attitudes about teaching with multiple strategies as they were using our materials. And we explored students' reactions to these pilot materials. So there was a lot to tell in this pilot work that we described, and we felt we learned from it, and there was something to be learned for the field as well. So what did we come up with from all this process of materials development? This is a slide you've seen before. This is what the materials looked like in the prior study. We were trying to adapt this, so not only did it include a greater focus of different content areas, but also maybe it was a little more engaging, interactive, designed for a teacher to use in a whole class setting. So let me show you what we came up with. This is a page from our curriculum. There were many such pages. I know that the text is a little small from the back, but I'm going to point out certain features of this page. The headliners of this material are the two characters at the bottom. On the left is Alex, on the right is Morgan. Alex and Morgan appeared in all of the materials, although they weren't always dressed like this. They changed their outfits sometimes. And you can see in this particular case, Alex and Morgan are solving the same problem, which is a problem that you've seen, and they do it in two different ways, the two different methods that I demonstrated for you. You can see their math steps, and you can see their dialogue. At the bottom are some questions that are for reflection on the methods that might be posed to students, or the teacher leads, or the teacher asks students to write about. There's lots of uses for those questions. In particular, what I hope you'll notice about this page is, first off, as with the materials you saw in the previous study, the key ingredient was that examples were placed side by side here on the same page. So that's the first thing you should notice about this. And the second is that there's purposeful visual alignment and use of common language to draw attention to similarities. We just didn't slap together two methods. We had to think about how we could make it so the comparison was fruitful. How can you get something out of the comparison? So the alignment is there. Excuse me. It's designed so that the examples that are compared are mostly similar but a little different, so maybe the differences pop out at you a little bit. And the third feature I'll point out to you is that these questions at the bottom were not generic for all the examples, but they were customized to the particular learning goal of this example. So if you notice there's a red box at the top there, and you may not be able to read it, but it says which is better. And that's an indication of what type of material this page was. Its learning objective was to think about which of these two methods is better and why for this problem. So that was one flavor of method, of example that we produced, the which is better, but it was not the only flavor. There were several others. For example, here's another one, and its flavor is which is correct. And in which is correct ones, we would see students looking at two different ways of solving a problem where one student made a common error, and the goal of this example was to understand where the error arose, why the error was made, and who made the error, who's right. And I'll point out here that it often comes up that we counterbalance the order of who got right and who got wrong. So it wasn't the case that Morgan was always wrong or that Alex was always wrong. It was all mixed up. A third flavor of materials here was why does it work? And that's what this is illustrating here. And why does it work was intended to be more conceptual. And it was looking in this particular case about the concept of slope and the slope formula. So Morgan is calculating the slope based on the slope formula, where Alex is plotting some points on a line, and the questions are designed to get students to think about what slope means and why the formula works and how the formula yields the same answer as the method of just plotting points and counting boxes. So the curriculum as a whole had on the order of 150 of these pages that span the whole curriculum. It was designed to be used as a supplement to whatever teachers were already doing in math class in their algebra book, and they could just pull one out whenever they wanted to use it and supplement whatever they were doing. So that's about the curriculum materials. As I mentioned a moment ago, we had some work to do about teacher professional development and measures. So with respect to the teacher PD, we did an initial pilot of a summer PD with a small group of teachers where we were really working with them on comparing multiple strategies and trying to figure out how we could design a PD that really was effective about this approach. Then we designed and implemented a full 1 week PD that was intended to be a real close pilot to what we actually wanted to do, and we worked with a small group of teachers on this to see if it worked. And in terms of measures, we felt like that we needed to do a little exploration about the relationship between conceptual knowledge, procedural knowledge, and flexibility as we were designing measures for the whole year, and so we did a nice study on that as well. All of this work led us to be ready to actually design a study, and that study looks as follows. We worked with 141 8th and 9th grade Algebra 1 teachers. Half of them were randomly chosen to receive the professional development and to use our materials all year, and we called those teachers the X team. And the other half were a business as usual control. They just taught their Algebra 1 class as they normally would. This study was a waitlist control design, which means in the second year, what happened is the X team teachers who had already seen the materials and gotten the PD, they continued to use them for the whole second year without any more PD. Whereas the Y team teachers then received our summer PD and used them for the whole year. We worked with teachers from 85 schools and 66 districts, and so if you do the math there, it's clear that most teachers were the only teacher in their school doing this. It was just a bunch of teachers from all over the place who were implementing this themselves. In terms of the measures of this study, we had two. One was a standardized commercial algebra test that we rented, if you will, that was administered at the beginning and the end of the year. And the second was our own algebra assessment that we developed that assessed not only flexibility based on our learnings from the prior work, but conceptual and procedural knowledge. It was multiple choice, and again, administered at the beginning and the end of the year, and you can see the reliabilities of these assessments was pretty good for this kind of work. In terms of the professional development, we knew that this was an absolutely critical part of this work, that we design high quality professional development, and since we work a little in this area, we really understood the literature about what should happen in this PD. So let me tell you what we developed. And you saw the piloting results that I spoke about a moment ago. This was a full week in the summer, 35-hour PD, where teachers did, among other things, they were introduced to the materials we developed and our intended pedagogical approach. They viewed videotaped exemplars of other teachers using these materials. They taught their own sample lessons and evaluated others' instruction of these sample lessons. They developed familiarity with our desired implementation model, what we hoped this looked like in their classroom, which was closely related to our implementation fidelity measure to see if they actually were doing so. So this was the PD. It was based on the exit surveys that we gave. It was positively viewed, and the teachers got out a lot of it, and we felt like our goals were met from this PD. In terms of other measures that we collected the usual demographics here about teachers, including this list, and students. And we also collected a prior knowledge measure for students, which was their state standardized test score that immediately preceded the study, which would have been the 6th grade score. Teachers who agreed to participate in this work were asked to do the following. They were given this PD and all the materials and taught how to use it, and then asked to use the materials at least once per week, adhering to the desired implementation model as closely as possible. And again, the way this was working is they were teaching their normal Algebra 1 curriculum with their usual district adopted curricula, and they had this stack of other pages that they could pick and choose however they wanted to use as a supplement. And they had a lot of flexibility in how they would do so and when they would do so. We just asked them to do it at least once a week using the model that they practiced all summer. They gave pre and post assessments. They also completed a short implementation log after each use of our curriculum materials. It took them about 5 minutes online. And we asked them to submit some video to us as well. If they were using our materials, the treatment group, they were asked to submit 1 video a month when they were teaching with our stuff and 1 when they were not. And if they were in the control group, they were asked to send us 1 video a month of any lesson that they wanted to. Before I tell you the results of the study, I need to tell you one important feature of how this transpired, which is surprising on one sense, but very common in this kind of work, which is about attrition. So these kind of big studies, it's very common that you lose a lot of teachers for lots of reasons, and our study was no exception. We started with 141 teachers. By the time the study was over, we had only 68 of them left. So that's over half of them decided not to participate. Luckily, when we recruited teachers, we recruited everyone that was interested in doing this. So we were very high in terms of the number needed for the power in conducting this kind of work. So even with all of this attrition, we still had enough teachers left to run the analysis we wanted to do. But it's still noteworthy to note that we lost a lot of teachers. Why did we lose those teachers? Well, some reasons were things you might expect, like loss of job. This was several years ago, and in the state we were working at, there were a lot of teachers that lost their jobs. And furthermore, you had to be teaching Algebra 1 when you signed up for this. And so teachers signed up in April or May saying, yes, I'm teaching Algebra 1. And by September, they were no longer teaching Algebra 1, and so they had to drop out of the study. It happens. And then we had plenty of other teachers that dropped out for what we euphemistically call an explained discontinuation of contact. So, in terms of the results, the first type of analysis that we did of this is what is called an intent to treat analysis, and this means that you just look at the treatment students and the control, the treatment teachers and students, the control treatment and students, and you just see, was there an effect? Without knowing anything about what's going on in the classrooms, is there just an effect? And the answer to this question is pretty easy to give, which is no. There was no effect here. There was no significant effect on any of our outcome measures between the treatment and the control. But as we sort of waded through our disappointment and our tears at this finding, we quickly looked a little more deeply into the results, and it became clear that teachers used the materials a lot less than intended. And that really, as you'll see, has a lot to do with these results. In particular, when we looked at the implementation log data, which is this online 5-minute thing they had to fill out every time they used our materials, we found that treatment teachers used our materials on average about 20 times during the year. We asked them to use it about once a week. So 20 times is half, a little less than half of what we were hoping they would use it. Furthermore, and even more critically, we found that 18% of treatment teachers did not report using our materials at all. So they had this great PD. In the summer they loved, they went back to their classrooms, they never used our materials at all. Andrew, yeah.
I just ask you one question
Yeah.
about the design. So your request that teachers use the materials as frequently as you did, was that sort of based on, I hate to use this term, but I'm going to use it anyway, sort of like dosage from earlier studies, sort of a minimum amount of sort of thinking about comparisons, or to develop flexibility that students needed in earlier work, or how did you determine?
Yeah, good. So we, I'm going to use the word dosage in a minute, actually, so it's not a bad word at all. But
you may know.
So I wouldn't say that we had a precise threshold from our prior work that said if you use it this much, you get the effect, but less than this much, you do not. So our studies were not designed to give us some precision on that answer, but we wanted to provide some structure when they asked us how much should we use it. And this was a number we came up with. We could have said once every other week and looked to see whether that had any effect. But we sort of chose once a week as an intuitive guess as to how much you had to use this to start to change the culture of the class a little bit about this type of conversation to be had about comparison.
It's also balanced against sort of how much you could ask teachers to modify their practice.
Yeah, although it was too much in that regard, I guess. We may have been better off had we chosen a lower bar, although I'm not sure. I mean, it is worth considering here that the way we recruited these teachers are we asked for volunteers, and every single one who volunteered was super interested and excited about this, because that's how we did the volunteering. We didn't go to a district and said to our superintendent and say, can we work with all of your teachers? Everyone signs on. We posted to email lists everywhere, and we told them about the study, comparing multiple strategies, Algebra 1, who's in. They were all in. They did get some good money for this, but they were all enthusiastic. So there are lots of reasons why they didn't use it. It wasn't because of lack of interest upon sign-up. We're pretty confident about that. There's another piece of information about they're not using it as much. 30% reported using these materials 5 or fewer times during the year. So again, a big chunk of teachers weren't using our materials, and if you know something about this intent to treat analysis, it treats treatment teachers all the same, whether you're the treatment teacher who used it every week or the treatment teacher who never used it the whole year. You're still a treatment teacher. And so that explains why this analysis, there was really no reason once we figured this out to expect that it would produce results. So we went then to a different kind of analysis based on teachers' use of materials, and what we wanted to know is whether for teachers who used our materials more, did their students learn more? And so that's what we did next. And so there's an analytical technique that we learned that allows you to explore questions like this that's called IVE, Instrumental Variable Estimation, and it does use terms like dose-response relationship. That's what this method does. And so what we used as the dosage for this method is the estimated number of minutes that teachers used our materials in the year. And we figured that out using their log data and their video data to come up with a number of minutes that seem to account for how much they used our materials, and you can see the range here. So we did this very complicated analytical method to see whether we found differences based on dosage, and some good news. We found that dosage had a marginally significant effect on procedural knowledge, which was one of our 3 outcome measures. Remember, it was conceptual knowledge, procedural knowledge, flexibility, and you can see that it only rose to the level of almost being significant for procedural knowledge, which means teachers who used our materials more had students who became better at solving a wide variety of algebra problems. So that's good. It's not as good as we hoped, but it's some positive news. When we looked at this data a little more carefully and a little more qualitatively, if you will, this is a graph just showing some extrapolation of what these results look like. And what I'm showing here is the pre-post gains on our assessment. And in the gray bar, you see the overall average of all students, both in the overall measure and broken down in these 3 knowledge types. On the red bar to the left, you see the first quartile of dosage. Those are the students in classes that got the lowest exposure to our materials. And the white is those who got the highest exposure to our materials. And you can see that all of these are in the right direction. All of these are showing that if you use our materials more, you had greater gains. But again, none of these rose to a significance level except for the procedural knowledge, which was close. So disappointing, but at least this is moving in the right direction. It suggests something was going on potentially that we want to continue to explore. So doing a big, huge study like this, it is not sufficient to just have one paper that comes out of it that says, here are the results, moving on, because you just devoted 3 years of your life to this study. So there's necessary to come up with lots of other papers that might relate to interesting findings that you do from this, and that's what we've started to do now. And one that I want to talk about here is we wanted to learn a little more about flexibility gains. There were differences. Some teachers had students with lots of flexibility gains, and some teachers had students with minimal flexibility gains. How can we understand how that came about? So we started to do some analyses of this, and I want to tell you some of the things we found. The first is that we found that lower pretext flexibility was associated with greater gains in flexibility. Some people talk about this with the phrase, those with the most to gain, gain the most. This is a little counterintuitive. It means that if you started out being moderately flexible, knowledge of some solution methods, multiple solution methods perhaps, then you didn't grow as much as those who started much lower. And this was not merely a ceiling effect, because everyone started out on the lowest side, but somehow it suggests to us something about how if you already know a bunch of strategies, maybe you're reluctant to learn more strategies. You sort of figure, I got enough. But if you really don't know many at all, then maybe that is motivation or there's interest in expanding your flexibility to greater heights. Something that we want to continue to explore, but there were some interesting suggestive findings here. A second thing that we found that was interesting is that teacher characteristics, such as age, degree attainment, etc., were not predictive of flexibility gains. The literature would suggest things like, oh, if the teacher is more experienced or has higher mathematical knowledge for teaching, then they're going to yield greater gains in flexibility than a teacher with less, and we did not find that in our study, that the teacher characteristics really had no effect on anything. We're still trying to understand why this might occur. One hypothesis is that maybe flexibility was a relatively new thing for many of these teachers and not something they were focusing on, so patterns from the literature that suggest these relationships might not hold, since it might not be an explicit focus for these teachers, for all of them, even though they took our PD. A third finding that we had related to flexibility gains had to do with teachers' instruction. So we did a qualitative analysis of some videos that we received. We looked at a sample of 3 teachers who had very high gains among their students in flexibility, and 3 other teachers who had very low gains, and we looked at them for a long time, trying to figure out whether we could see any differences. And one thing that seemed to emerge as being different were about the kind of questions that these teachers were asking. And in particular, we found that teachers who had high gain in flexibility in their students were more frequently asking open-ended questions. Questions like, for their students to articulate or re-articulate the instructional emphasis of the comparison material. So what did we learn about this? Why is that true? Questions like that. So this is a finding that converges with the existing math ed literature that might suggest that asking of these kinds of questions is a good thing instructionally, and we were happy to see it show up in the domain of flexibility here. So this study answered, or began to answer some questions, but also yielded a lot of new questions for us that we are continuing to explore, including studies that we are exploring by moving out of the classroom back into more laboratory environments. I want to mention a few of these. The first, in terms of some short-term work we're doing on flexibility, is that we're trying to develop better measures for flexibility in equation solving as well as other math domains. We've chosen to work in equation solving because it's been a convenient domain for us, but we feel like this is an applicable construct for lots of other domains. We want to learn more about it in those domains. I'll mention one example here. I'm working with a mathematician, Canadian mathematician, on undergraduate calculus and looking at flexibility in undergraduate calculus, which is interesting, and he presented those results just recently at the joint math meetings. I'm also looking at flexibility cross-culturally. I have some colleagues in China and in Finland, and they're exploring this with me in terms of their countries. And I'm happy to talk later if anyone wants to know why I think there might be some interesting differences cross-culturally in flexibility, because I do think there are. In terms of the longer term, the bigger picture of where I see this work going, I wanted to identify two bigger issues that we're considering and that we're exploring. The first is generally exploring the relationship between flexibility, prior knowledge, and procedural skill. I alluded to this relationship and its complexity in a couple of places in this talk. In the first, I sort of said at the beginning that do we expect students to use multiple strategies all the time, or are there some times where it makes sense for them to stick with one strategy and not use multiple strategies? It suggests that our results suggest that maybe that depends on what they know, their prior knowledge. Maybe if you know too much, you're more or less likely to be flexible. This relationship between fluency and flexibility is nuanced. If you want students to know more than one approach, should you teach them more than one approach from the first day of learning? Or should you teach them one strategy they get pretty good at, and then when they get good at that, then you teach them lots of other strategies? That seems to be a very important question that we need to learn more about if we really are interested in flexibility. Our data suggested some findings there, but there's more work to be done. And a second big question that relates to flexibility that I'm exploring has to do with what I call the nature of good instruction on procedures. I argue that in the secondary curriculum, we are teaching procedures. We will be teaching procedures. It's necessary to teach procedures. And so we need to think about what that means to teach procedures well. It may be the case that the instructional principles that we would identify as being about good math instruction generally are also what's good for teaching procedures. Or it may be that there's certain things that are especially important when you're teaching procedures that may not have as much relevance when you're teaching other kinds of concepts. As I noted in the very beginning, my perspective is that I don't think the field has adequately considered the teaching of procedures and what it looks like for that to be good. And that's what I'm interested in learning more about. If our interest is in flexibility or good procedural knowledge, deep procedural knowledge, what should instruction look like that might engender that? Briefly, I wanted to say a couple things about this movement between the lab and the classroom that I think are interesting to my work. The first is that when I began doing this type of work, I would have probably thought that the lab and the classroom represented some sort of dichotomy. There's the lab, there's the classroom. But I haven't found that to be the case. It's not a dichotomy at all. It's been much more like a continuum. I talked about my study that we just described as the classroom study, study 3. I would say that's definitely a classroom study from my perspective. It was teachers teaching in their own classrooms. They received PD and a curriculum. They went off and they used it, and we studied whether it worked. On the other side of this, you might have what I would call truly lab studies, which I didn't tell you any of those because I really haven't done any. Truly lab studies for me are in the lab, often working with psych undergraduates, doing rather contrived tasks. Useful, important studies, but none that I have described here. Rather, I feel like my other two studies I talked about with you fall somewhere in this continuum. I might say that the study 2 that I did, which was the one where we used the compare and the sequential conditions, I would call that maybe a lab classroom study. It was a week. We took over the classroom. We gave instruction in 2 or 3 days. The students were working in pairs. There wasn't a lot of whole class instruction. So it wasn't authentic classroom environments. It wasn't lab. It was somewhere on the lab side of this. I would say that study 1, I don't know, do I call that a classroom lab study? It was a little closer to the classroom end in that I taught it like a summer math course, but there was some lab components to it as well. So this is a continuum, and as I hope you heard, in our work, this has been bidirectional. It's not just from the lab to the classroom, it's back. That we learn things from the classroom studies that suggest they might need to be explored back in the lab. The second observation that I have about this kind of work is that it required and does require interdisciplinary teams. and I'm not sure I had a full appreciation of this before I went into this work, that it requires people knowledgeable about the content and about teacher professional development and about design of psychological studies and about the statistical expertise to do the methods of analysis you do and about people to recruit all the teachers that we needed for this. It was a lot of work on our end, and had I done this again, I think I would have been a lot more careful in selecting a team of people to do this and not just my team. So the complexity of this kind of work really necessitates diverse expertise. And third and finally, I'd like to say that I viewed this as being vitally important for people like me to do, to take lab work toward, if not into, the classroom. And I don't think that's as common as I would like it to be in the field of people that straddle psychology and math education. Too much of it is focused in the lab. This is hard work to move in the classroom, but I leave this hard work and these somewhat disappointing results still thinking, if not me, then who? This is the kind of work that people like me should be doing, and I think there's probably some in the room who might be in the same boat. So, to review where we've been coming for this past hour, what should our students be learning? I'm arguing that flexibility is important, and that's what my work has been focused on. The instructional strategies that I've been pursuing with regard to flexibility, particularly have to do with comparison to multiple strategies. I've been pursuing these themes through moving from the lab to the classroom and back, as well as living at this intersection between math education and ed psych. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions and discussion. Thank you. Yes.
So I was interested in the finding that had to do with the background of the teachers not having anything to do with what happened with their students' learning, essentially.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what measure of mathematical knowledge and teaching you used for these teachers.
So we used the Hill, Ball et al. Algebra form for that. And they took it at the beginning of the study, and it didn't show up to be significant on any of the outcome measures. I will say that those measures, I think, were optimally designed for K6, and they do have an algebra measure. Our teachers scored at about the mean and above on that measure. There wasn't as much variance as they found in some of their other work. I think these teachers were all experienced Algebra 1 teachers, and they did reasonably well on this measure, so that might be one explanation for that measure. Yes,
I was kind of wondering about that as well, but it seems like it could be the case that there's very special knowledge that even teachers who do or don't score high or not high on the Hill Ball stuff, you know, maybe have or don't have, that could make a difference. You know, there's particular knowledge about this particular topic.
I think that's an interesting hypothesis.
Yeah.
I mean, in support of that, when we were first talking to teachers who agreed to participate in the study about what the study was about, and we were talking to them about multiple methods and comparison to multiple methods, some of them had greater knowledge of multiple methods than others. So some of them would say, oh yeah, well, I teach them multiple methods for solving systems of linear equations, but are there multiple methods for other problems that we would be doing in Algebra 1? And so that's an example of some specialized knowledge that some brought. Although even that, I think, well, we did administer this measure toward the beginning, but I would say they quickly came to see that point. That wasn't a hard case to make for them, that they were multiple measures. I think they had thought of it as being not applicable except in certain domains, but as soon as we sort of broadened their perspective just a little bit, then they kind of understood that yes, oh, there's actually multiple methods for just about every problem that we do. Jeremy, yeah.
I think the same point could be made about the kids. That is, I think there's the question of how much they might be learning multiple methods and how much they might be given permission to use multiple methods. And the rules in the classroom are you can't do it more than one. You shouldn't do it the non-standard way. So they don't do it that way, although they might know how to do that. So I guess I'm struck by the fact that in your measurement process, you almost need to measure how much they're learning about multiple methods and how much they're learning about or changing their attitude about whether multiple methods are allowable in this context, because they haven't been.
It's a great point. So we have anecdotal evidence that in classes where this worked well, those sort of attitudinal changes were transpiring. And though I've been finding flexibility with these two very measurable characteristics, you know multiple strategies, you can pick the most appropriate one. There's no denying in my point of view that this is more of a way of thinking or a mindset, if you will, among students and teachers. And so when we found it working well in classrooms, perhaps where the teachers were using our materials a lot and making this something that was okay or desirable, we would find instances where a teacher would be teaching a regular lesson, not our materials at all, and they would be going through a rather traditional lesson, and then in the middle of that, some kid would raise their head in the back of the room and say, I know another way to do that. And for us, that was an indication that this was actually infusing the classroom culture in a way that was exactly what we intended. And it's part of the reason why we gave teachers so much flexibility in how they were using our materials. We actually encouraged them to make their own materials too, which some teachers did, using the template that we gave them and the instructional guidance that we provided. And so in some teachers this really did take over, and it really was an attitudinal shift for them. And in some ways that may be a necessary condition, I think is your point, and it's something that we would need to think more about in our PD. How can we get teachers to think about how to affect that attitudinal change in their students? I'd say that we felt that teachers did make that shift in their own thinking during the PD, but it's another whole thing to how to change that in their students.
So Dr. Star will be here for another hour if you guys want to chat with him individually, but we greatly appreciate you guys coming out here to work his clothing. Thank you.
Thanks.